Hi, I'm Marcus. At my grandfather's funeral, my own family made me serve sandwiches while they accepted condolences from the whole town. They whispered about how I'd never amounted to anything, how I was the disappointment who couldn't even afford a decent suit. Then an officer burst through those church doors asking for the chief of police, and suddenly everyone's eyes were on me. What they didn't know was that I'd been keeping a secret for 5 years, one that would change everything they thought they knew about the family failure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, sometimes the people closest to you can't see past their own assumptions. Sometimes they're so busy writing your story that they forget you're the one living it. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who should know you best? Tell me, how did you prove them wrong? The autumn air in Millfield, Ohio carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke that Tuesday morning when I pulled into the gravel parking lot of St. Michael's Community Center. The building squatted between two empty storefronts on Main Street, its faded brick facade a testament to better times when the steel mill still employed half the town. I sat in my rental car for a moment, watching my breath fog the windshield, trying to summon the courage to face what waited inside. My grandfather's funeral was supposed to be a celebration of life, but I knew better. Joseph Thompson had been the backbone of this family for 87 years, and now that he was gone, the wolves were circling. I'd driven 4 hours from Columbus, taking personal leave from my job, hoping this one day might bridge the gap that had grown between me and the family I'd left behind. The optimism felt foolish now, as I watched familiar figures moving through the parking lot, their postures already defensive, their glances toward my modest sedan dismissive. Aunt Linda emerged from a gleaming black SUV, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the wind. She wore a black dress that probably cost more than most people in Millfield made in a week, her jewelry catching the weak morning sun. Behind her came my cousin Jessica, 28, and already carrying herself with the same entitled air that had made family gatherings unbearable when we were kids. Uncle Robert pulled up in his pickup truck, the bed loaded with folding chairs and serving trays, his movements efficient and businesslike even in grief. I'd been away for 10 years, visiting only occasionally, and each time the distance between us seemed to stretch wider. They saw me as the kid who'd run off to the city, too good for small-town life, too proud to come home when things got tough. What they didn't know was that I'd built something they couldn't imagine, earned respect they'd never thought to give me, become someone they'd never expected me to be. But that knowledge felt cold comfort as I straightened my tie and walked toward the door where my cousin Kevin waited with barely concealed disdain. The community center smelled of industrial carpet and the lingering aroma of countless potluck dinners. Folding tables lined the walls, covered in white tablecloths that couldn't quite hide their institutional origins. In the front of the room, Grandpa Joe's casket sat surrounded by flowers, photographs, and the accumulated tokens of a life well lived in a town that remembered its own. The sight of it hit me harder than I'd expected, a sharp reminder of Sunday afternoons on his front porch, listening to stories about the old days when the mill ran 3 shifts and Main Street bustled with purpose. Linda approached me with a smile that never reached her eyes, her hand extended in a greeting that felt more like a business transaction than family affection. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she'd perfected over the years, the one that managed to sound warm while cutting deep. "I wasn't sure you'd make it. I know how busy you must be with that office job of yours." The emphasis she placed on office job made it sound like something mildly embarrassing, a career path for people who couldn't handle real work. I'd learned years ago not to correct her assumptions about my life. The truth was complicated, and Linda had never been interested in complications that didn't serve her narrative. She preferred the simple story where I was the nephew who'd gotten too big for his britches, who'd left town with grand dreams only to settle into mediocrity somewhere else. It kept things neat, allowed her to maintain her position as the family success story, the one who'd married well and built a comfortable life without ever leaving Millfield. The morning passed in a blur of handshakes and condolences from people who remembered me as Joe Thompson's grandson, but couldn't quite place the man I'd become. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store squeezed my hand and told me how proud Grandpa had been, how he'd talked about me every time he came in for his weekly shopping. Mr. Kowalski, who'd worked alongside Joe at the mill for 30 years, shared stories about my grandfather's legendary work ethic and his habit of bringing homemade soup to anyone who called in sick. But even as the community embraced me with genuine warmth, my own family kept their distance. Linda had assigned herself the role of chief mourner, accepting condolences with practiced grace while directing the flow of visitors with subtle gestures and meaningful looks. Jessica worked the room like she was running for office, her smile bright and her conversation peppered with references to her marketing job in Cincinnati. Robert stood near the casket, solid and dependable as always, but his eyes held the weariness of a man who'd spent 40 years trying to keep peace in a family that specialized in quiet warfare. As the formal service ended, and people began moving toward the fellowship hall for lunch, Linda caught my arm with a grip that felt more like a constraint than comfort. "Marcus," she said, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper she used for family business, "I need you to help serve food. Jessica's handling the guest book, and Robert's taking care of the flowers. I know it's not glamorous work, but someone has to do it, and honestly, you're probably more comfortable with that kind of thing anyway." The dismissal stung because it was so casual, so automatic. In Linda's world, I was the family member you assigned to kitchen duty, while the important people handled public-facing responsibilities. She didn't see malice in it, which somehow made it worse. This was simply how she'd cataloged me in her mental filing system, and she couldn't conceive of any reason to update the entry. I found myself behind a folding table laden with sandwiches, potato salad, and casseroles that represented the best efforts of a grieving community. The food was simple but abundant, prepared with care by women who'd known my grandfather for decades and wanted to honor him with the traditional offerings of comfort and sustenance. I served plate after plate, listening to stories about Joe Thompson's kindness, his integrity, his willingness to help anyone who needed it. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was learning more about my grandfather from strangers than I ever had from the family members who claimed to know him best. From my position behind the serving table, I could watch the family dynamics play out like a well-rehearsed drama. Linda held court near the memorial display, graciously accepting the role of family spokesperson with the air of someone born to the position. Jessica circulated among the younger visitors, networking even at a funeral, collecting business cards and making connections that might prove useful later. Robert worked quietly in the background, emptying trash, wiping tables, doing the unglamorous work that kept everything running smoothly. But it was the whispered conversations that cut deepest. I caught fragments of family gossip as people passed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
My station, comments meant to be private but carrying clearly in the acoustics of the fellowship hall. Linda's voice drifted over during a lull in the lunch service, speaking to Mrs. Patterson from the church auxiliary about how hard it was to manage everything with limited family support. "Marcus tries to help," she said with a sigh that conveyed volumes, "but you know how it is with these city jobs. They keep him so busy behind a desk that he barely has time for family anymore." Mrs. Patterson made sympathetic noises, but I could see her confusion. She'd known me since childhood, remembered when I'd helped Joe with his yard work every summer, when I'd volunteered for every church cleanup and community project without being asked. The disconnect between her memories and Linda's narrative was visible in her furrowed brow, but she was too polite to challenge a grieving family member at a funeral. The afternoon wore on with the relentless rhythm of community grief. People came and went, sharing memories and offering comfort, their presence a testament to the impact my grandfather had made during his 87 years in Millfield. I kept serving, kept listening, kept absorbing the growing weight of family disapproval that seemed to settle heavier with each passing hour. Every request to refill a serving tray, every casual assignment of another menial task, reinforced the message that I was here on sufferance, welcomed only as long as I understood my place in the family hierarchy. The breaking point came during the late afternoon lull, when most of the community members had paid their respects and departed, leaving only family and close friends to begin the slow process of cleanup. I was wiping down tables when I overheard Linda speaking to her neighbor, Carol Mitchell, near the coffee station. Her voice carried that particular quality it took on, when she was sharing confidential information, loud enough to be overheard but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. "It's such a shame about Marcus," Linda was saying, her tone heavy with manufactured concern. "Joe always hoped he'd make something of himself, but some people just aren't built for success, you know, all those big dreams about making it in the city, and what does he have to show for it? A desk job that barely pays the bills and no family of his own." Joe never said anything, but I could tell he was disappointed. He kept asking when Marcus was going to settle down, find a good woman, maybe come back home where he belonged. The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to reinforce the narrative Linda had constructed about my life. The cruelest part was the invocation of my grandfather's supposed disappointment, a claim I couldn't challenge without seeming defensive or disrespectful to his memory. She was rewriting history in real time, transforming Joe's pride in my accomplishments into embarrassment at my failures, his understanding of my choices into confusion at my stubbornness. Carol's response was non-committal, the kind of diplomatic murmur people use when they're trapped in awkward conversations at social events. But Linda pressed on, warming to her theme with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a sympathetic audience. "I tried to help him when he first moved away," she continued, her voice taking on the martyr's tone she'd perfected over the years. "Sent him money when he was struggling, put him in touch with people who might help him find better work. But pride, you know how it is. Some people would rather struggle alone than accept help from family." The revision was breathtaking in its scope and shamelessness. Linda had never offered me money or job connections. In fact, she'd made it clear from the beginning that my decision to leave Millfield was a personal betrayal, an abandonment of family values and community loyalty. The few times I'd tried to share news of my success, she'd changed the subject or found ways to diminish my accomplishments. But now, in the aftermath of Joe's death, she was recasting herself as the supportive aunt, whose generosity had been spurned by an ungrateful nephew's stubborn pride. I finished wiping the table with deliberate care, focusing on the mechanical task to keep my hands from trembling with anger. The impulse to confront her was overwhelming, but I knew it would only confirm her narrative about my character, provide more evidence of the instability and poor judgment she'd spent years documenting for anyone who'd listen. Instead, I carried the cleaning supplies back to the kitchen, using the few moments of solitude to regain my composure and remember why I'd come here in the first place. My grandfather had been a man of quiet dignity, who'd built his reputation through consistent action rather than dramatic gestures. He'd taught me that respect was earned through behavior, not demanded through confrontation. The lesson felt particularly relevant now, as I struggled to honor his memory while protecting my own sanity in the face of family dysfunction that seemed designed to test both my patience and my principles. The kitchen was empty except for stacks of dirty dishes and the lingering smell of coffee that had been brewing too long. I found myself staring at the industrial sink, remembering summer afternoons, when Joe had taught me to wash dishes at his house, how he'd made even mundane chores feel important by talking about the value of work well done. He'd never cared about the prestige of a job or the size of a salary. What mattered to him was integrity, competence, and the willingness to serve others without expecting recognition or reward. Those lessons had shaped my career in ways Linda could never understand, had guided me through challenges she couldn't imagine, had led me to achievements that would have made Joe proud if he'd lived to see them fully realized. But the secrecy I'd maintained about my professional life, originally intended to protect my privacy and avoid family complications, had created a void that Linda had filled with her own assumptions and resentments. The sound of voices from the main hall reminded me that the day was far from over. There would be more cleanup, more subtle insults, more opportunities for Linda to demonstrate my inadequacy to anyone still paying attention. But there would also be more stories about Joe, more connections with community members who remembered him fondly, more chances to honor his memory in ways that transcended family politics and personal grievances. I dried my hands and returned to the fellowship hall, prepared to endure whatever the rest of the afternoon might bring. The tables needed to be folded, the chairs stacked, the decorations carefully packed away for return to their various owners. It was honest work, the kind Joe had always respected, and I could find dignity in it regardless of how my family chose to frame my participation. What I couldn't have anticipated was how dramatically the afternoon was about to change, how a single moment would shatter the carefully constructed narrative Linda had spent years building, how the truth I'd kept hidden would finally demand recognition in the most unexpected way possible. Sometimes life provides its own justice, its own moment of revelation, but rarely with such perfect timing or such devastating completeness. The stage was set, the players in position, the assumptions locked in place like pieces on a chessboard. All it would take was one external catalyst, one moment when the real world intruded on the closed system of family mythology, to reveal just how wrong they'd all been about the man they thought they knew. Parts 2. 5. The deceptive calm and rising tensions, the evening light filtered through the tall windows of St. Michael's Community Center, with that golden quality that made even the most ordinary moments feel touched by grace. Most of the mourners had departed, leaving behind the lingering warmth of shared memories and the comfortable exhaustion that follows genuine community gathering. I moved through the fellowship hall collecting abandoned coffee cups and crumpled napkins, finding unexpected peace in these simple tasks that connected me to my grandfather's values of service and humility. Linda had retreated to the kitchen with Carol Mitchell and two other women from the church auxiliary, their voices creating a steady murmur of conversation that occasionally rose and fell like distant music. From my position folding chairs against the far wall, I could catch fragments of their discussion, the comfortable gossip that small towns use to process grief and maintain social bonds. They spoke of Joe's final weeks, his stubborn independence even as his health declined, his insistence on maintaining his garden until the very end of the growing season. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, who had lived next door to my grandfather for 37 years, emerged from the kitchen carrying a covered casserole dish. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same simple bun she'd worn for decades, and her eyes held the particular sadness of someone who'd lost not just a neighbor but a piece of her own history. She paused when she saw me, her weathered face softening with recognition and something that might have been relief. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd taught Sunday school for 40 years, "I've been hoping to catch you before everyone left. Your grandfather talked about you all the time, you know. Every Sunday after church, every time I saw him working in his garden, he was so proud of what you'd accomplished, so grateful that you'd found your calling in life." Her words created a strange dissonance with everything I'd heard from my family throughout the day. Eleanor's version of Joe's feelings painted a completely different picture, one where my absence wasn't abandonment but adventure, where my career wasn't failure but fulfillment. The disconnect was jarring enough to make me question whether we'd all been attending the same man's funeral, mourning the same person's passing. Eleanor continued, seemingly unaware of my internal confusion. "He used to tell me stories about your phone calls, how excited you'd get when you talked about your work. Said you'd found something that mattered to you, something that made a real difference in people's lives. He never told me exactly what you did, mind you, but he always made it clear that whatever it was you were good at it and it was important work." The revelation hit me with unexpected force. My grandfather had understood, had been proud, had recognized the value in choices that the rest of the family dismissed as character flaws or personal failures. The phone calls Eleanor mentioned had been brief and infrequent, but apparently they'd carried more weight with Joe than I'd realized. Our conversations had focused on general updates and family news, but he'd read between the lines in ways I hadn't appreciated at the time. I thanked Eleanor with genuine emotion, my voice thick with gratitude for this unexpected gift of understanding. She patted my arm with the casual affection of someone who'd watched me grow up, then gathered her things and headed toward the parking lot, leaving me alone with thoughts that felt too large for the quiet fellowship hall. The knowledge that Joe had supported my choices, had taken pride in my accomplishments, created a warmth that spread through my chest like good whiskey on a cold night. The kitchen cleanup continued with mechanical efficiency, but my mind was elsewhere, processing this new information and trying to reconcile it with the narrative I'd been hearing all day. Linda's version of events, where Joe had been disappointed by my choices and confused by my priorities, now seemed less like fact and more like interpretation, less like truth, and more like projection of her own feelings onto a man who'd been too diplomatic to contradict her assumptions directly. Jessica emerged from the kitchen carrying a stack of serving platters, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum floor with the precise rhythm of someone accustomed to commanding attention through movement. She'd changed from her funeral dress into dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people in Millfield spent on clothing in a year. The transformation from grieving granddaughter to successful professional was complete, and she wore her accomplishments like armor against the provincial atmosphere of her hometown. "Marcus," she said, her tone carrying that particular blend of condescension and pity that family members use when they're about to deliver unwelcome advice. "I've been thinking about what Mom said earlier, about Grandpa Joe being disappointed. I know that probably hurt to hear, but maybe it's time you considered whether you're really happy with the choices you've made." She set the platters on a nearby table with unnecessary care, clearly preparing for a conversation she'd been rehearsing. Jessica had always been the family diplomat, skilled at delivering harsh truths with enough velvet wrapping to make them seem like kindness. But diplomacy required understanding, and her assumptions about my life were so fundamentally wrong that her well-meaning intervention felt more like mockery than concern. "I mean, look around," she continued, gesturing toward the community center with its faded carpet and institutional lighting. "This is where you came from, these are your people. There's no shame in coming back, in admitting that the big city dream didn't work out the way you hoped. Mom's been talking to Robert about maybe helping you find something locally, maybe at the county office or even the school district. It wouldn't be glamorous, but it would be stable, and you'd be closer to family." The offer was delivered with such genuine conviction that I almost felt guilty for the anger it provoked. Jessica truly believed she was extending a lifeline to a drowning man, offering salvation from a life of quiet desperation that existed only in her imagination. Her vision of my circumstances was so detailed and so wrong that correcting it would require dismantling years of carefully constructed assumptions about success, happiness, and the proper way to live a meaningful life. But what struck me most was the casual way she dismissed everything I'd built outside of Millfield. In Jessica's worldview, success was measured in proximity to family, in visible markers of conventional achievement, in the ability to be easily categorized and understood by people who'd known you since childhood. Anything that didn't fit those parameters was automatically suspect, probably temporary, almost certainly a mistake that time would eventually correct. I found myself studying her face as she spoke, looking for traces of the cousin I'd played with during childhood summers, the girl who'd shared my love of adventure stories and elaborate games of pretend. That Jessica had possessed imagination and curiosity, had been fascinated by possibilities that extended beyond the borders of familiar territory. But time and success had narrowed her vision, made her suspicious of choices that deviated from the approved script of education, career, marriage, and family within acceptable geographical boundaries. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Kevin, who entered the fellowship hall carrying a box of memorial programs and wearing the expression of someone who'd been volunteered for a task he didn't particularly want to complete. Kevin had always been the family rebel, the one who'd pushed boundaries and questioned authority, but his rebellions had been safely local, confined to acceptable forms of teenage misbehavior that never threatened the fundamental order of family expectations. At 32, he'd settled into the role of perpetual bachelor, working construction when the mood struck him, living in a trailer behind his parents' house, pursuing hobbies that included hunting, fishing, and maintaining an impressive collection of vintage motorcycles. The family tolerated his unconventional lifestyle because it was comprehensible, because his failures were visible, and therefore manageable, because he'd never challenged their assumptions about what constituted legitimate success. "Hey Marcus," he said, his greeting carrying the easy familiarity of someone who'd never felt the need to prove himself to anyone. "Jessica giving you the lecture about coming home where you belong. She gave me the same speech last Christmas, right after she finished explaining how I needed to grow up and find a real job." Jessica's cheeks flushed with annoyance, but Kevin continued before she could respond. "The thing is," he said, settling onto one of the folding chairs with the loose-limbed grace of someone who'd never met a social situation he couldn't navigate, "some people just aren't built for the conventional life. Some people need to find their own way, even if it doesn't make sense to everybody else." His words carried unexpected wisdom, and I found myself grateful for this support from an unexpected source. Kevin might not have achieved traditional success, but he'd maintained his authenticity in ways that commanded respect. He'd refused to pretend to be something he wasn't, had chosen honesty over approval, had built a life that satisfied him regardless of external validation. The conversation might have continued in this philosophical direction, but Linda's voice cut through the air with the sharp efficiency of someone reclaiming control of a situation that had wandered outside acceptable boundaries. "Marcus," she called from the kitchen doorway, "we need to talk about the house. Joe left some papers that need to be sorted through, and since you're here, you might as well make yourself useful." Her tone made it clear that this wasn't a request but a command, delivered with the authority of someone who'd appointed herself executor of family business regardless of official designations. Linda had always possessed the ability to transform suggestions into obligations, to frame personal preferences as community needs, to make resistance seem selfish and unreasonable. The house she referenced sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, a modest 2-story structure that Joe had maintained with the meticulous care of someone who understood that neglect compounded over time. It had been his refuge and his project, the place where he'd cultivated both vegetables and memories with equal dedication. The thought of Linda sorting through his personal belongings, making decisions about what to keep and what to discard, based on her own priorities and prejudices, felt like a violation of everything the place had meant to him. I followed her outside into the evening air, which had grown crisp with the promise of frost. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few cars belonging to family members and the church volunteers who always stayed until the last dish was washed and the last chair stacked. The streetlights along Main Street had begun to flicker on, casting pools of yellow light that made the empty storefronts look more abandoned than usual. Linda's SUV was parked near the center entrance, its black paint reflecting the community center's exterior lighting like a mirror. She opened the passenger door and began retrieving boxes and folders, her movements efficient but somehow aggressive, as if the paperwork had personally offended her. These had belonged to Joe, the accumulated documentation of a life lived with careful attention to detail and responsibility. Robert appeared beside us carrying more boxes, his face wearing the expression of someone who'd been conscripted into a project that made him uncomfortable.
He'd always been the gentler of my aunt and uncle, more inclined toward diplomacy than confrontation, but his loyalty to Linda was absolute and unquestioning. He nodded at me with something that might have been sympathy before loading his burden into the back of the SUV. "We're going to the house now," Linda announced, her voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence.
There's work to be done, decisions to be made, and frankly, Marcus, you owe it to this family to help. You've been absent for most of the hard stuff, the doctor visits and the hospital stays and all the daily care that Joe needed these last few years. The least you can do is help clean up the mess he left behind. Her accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to make defense difficult. I had been absent during Joe's decline, had relied on phone calls and occasional visits to maintain our connection, had trusted that other family members were providing the care and attention he needed. But the guilt she was trying to provoke felt manufactured, designed more to establish her moral authority than to address any genuine grievance about my behavior. The drive to Joe's house took less than 10 minutes, but it felt longer in the tense silence of Linda's SUV. She'd assigned me to the back seat like a child being transported to a necessary but unpleasant appointment, while Jessica rode shotgun and provided a running commentary about the changes that had occurred in Millfield during my absence. Most of the updates were depressing, stories of businesses closing and families moving away as the economic foundation of the town continued to erode. Joe's house sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by mature oak trees that had dropped most of their leaves in preparation for winter. The structure looked smaller than I remembered from childhood, but well maintained, with fresh paint on the shutters and a roof that showed no signs of neglect. The front porch still held the swing where Joe had spent summer evenings, reading the newspaper and watching the sun set over the fields that stretched beyond his property line. Linda produced a key from her purse with the theatrical flourish of someone revealing evidence in a criminal trial. She'd obtained it from Joe's lawyer, she explained, along with the authority to secure his property and begin the process of settling his estate. The implication was clear. She was in charge now, the responsible family member who could be trusted with important decisions while others had been pursuing selfish interests elsewhere. The interior of the house felt frozen in time, preserved exactly as Joe had left it on the morning he'd been rushed to the hospital for the final time. His coffee cup still sat beside his favorite chair, a crossword puzzle half completed on the side table, reading glasses folded neatly on top of the morning newspaper. The scene suggested a life interrupted rather than concluded, as if he'd simply stepped outside for a moment and would return to finish what he'd started. Linda moved through the rooms with the efficiency of someone conducting an inventory, opening drawers and examining contents with the detached professionalism of an appraiser. She'd already divided Joe's possessions into categories in her mind, had determined what was valuable, what was sentimental, and what was simply clutter to be disposed of without ceremony. Her approach to grief was organizational, her way of processing loss was through control and action. The office drew my attention because it was the one room in the house that reflected Joe's personality most completely. The walls were covered with photographs spanning decades of family history, community involvement, and personal achievement. His desk held the carefully organized paperwork of someone who'd managed his own affairs with precision and care. But it was the bulletin board above his workspace that stopped me cold, my breath catching in my throat as I absorbed what I was seeing. Newspaper clippings covered the cork surface, dozens of them, all featuring stories about police work, community safety, and law enforcement achievements. Some were local articles from the Millfield Gazette about crime prevention and public safety initiatives. Others were from Columbus newspapers, more substantial pieces about major investigations, policy changes, and department recognitions. At the center of the display, printed from an online source and carefully mounted, was a photograph of me in full dress uniform receiving a commendation from the mayor. Joe had been following my career with the dedication of a sports fan tracking his favorite team's season. Every promotion, every public recognition, every newspaper mention of my work had found its way onto this bulletin board, creating a visual record of accomplishments that he'd apparently celebrated in private while my family had dismissed them as insignificant. The discovery felt like finding buried treasure, like uncovering evidence of a love and pride that had been hidden but never absent. Linda's voice cut through my emotional fog like a blade through silk. "What are you staring at?" she demanded, her tone sharp with suspicion. "Those old newspaper clippings." Joe always was a pack rat, keeping every piece of paper that came through the door. "Most of it's just junk that needs to be thrown away." She moved closer, her eyes scanning the bulletin board with the dismissive efficiency she applied to everything that didn't immediately serve her purposes. But as her gaze settled on the photograph at the center of the display, her expression changed, confusion replacing certainty, questions forming in her mind, faster than her assumptions could answer them. The image showed me in a police chief's uniform, standing beside civic leaders at what was clearly an official ceremony, receiving recognition for something that required formal acknowledgement. Jessica appeared beside her mother, drawn by the sudden silence that had settled over the room like dust. Her eyes widened as she processed the same visual information that had stopped Linda cold, her assumptions about my life colliding with evidence that contradicted everything she'd believed. The newspaper clippings created an undeniable timeline of professional advancement, of responsibility and achievement, of success measured by standards that even she couldn't dismiss as irrelevant. "What is this?" Linda whispered, her voice stripped of its usual authority. "This picture, these articles. I don't understand what I'm looking at." The moment felt suspended, balanced on the edge of revelation, charged with the potential to transform years of misunderstanding into clarity. But before I could find words to explain what should have been obvious, the sound of gravel crunching in the driveway announced the arrival of another vehicle. Through the window, I could see the distinctive silhouette of a police cruiser, its emergency lights dark, but its presence unmistakably official. Car doors slammed, voices carried across the evening air, footsteps approached the front porch with the measured pace of people conducting business rather than paying social visits. Linda looked at me with growing confusion, and something that might have been the first stirrings of doubt about the narrative she'd constructed so carefully over the years. The doorbell rang with the simple two-note chime that Joe had installed decades earlier, its familiar sound now carrying weight it had never possessed before. Linda moved toward the front door with the uncertain steps of someone who'd suddenly lost confidence in her ability to control the situation, while Jessica remained frozen in place, staring at the bulletin board as if it might rearrange itself into something more comprehensible. Robert appeared in the office doorway, his face reflecting the same confusion that had overtaken the women. He'd heard the police car arrive, had seen the official nature of the visit, and was clearly wondering what connection any of this might have to a family gathering at a dead man's house. His eyes moved from the newspaper clippings to my face, searching for explanations that I wasn't yet ready to provide. The sound of Linda opening the front door carried clearly through the house, followed by the deeper voices of men conducting official business. One of them was asking questions, requesting information, seeking someone with authority to help with a situation that had apparently developed elsewhere in town. Their voices grew clearer as they entered the house, their footsteps announcing their approach toward the office where we stood surrounded by the evidence of my grandfather's pride and my family's ignorance. What happened next would change everything, would force conversations that had been avoided for years, would reveal truths that had been hidden behind assumptions and pride. The careful balance of family mythology was about to be shattered by the simple intrusion of reality into a closed system that had functioned on misinformation and willful blindness. The voices in the hallway grew closer, carrying with them the weight of external validation and the promise of justice that sometimes arrives wearing a uniform, and speaking with the calm authority of people who deal in facts rather than family politics. Linda's voice joined the conversation, still trying to maintain control, still attempting to manage a situation she didn't understand, while the truth waited in the next room, like a loaded weapon ready to discharge. Part 6 Mets 10, The Truth Emerges. Officer Jake Rodriguez stepped into Joe's living room with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to taking charge of uncertain situations. His uniform was crisp despite the long shift that had preceded this call, and his eyes held the alert focus of a professional assessing an environment for potential complications. Behind him came Sergeant Patricia Mills, a veteran officer whose reputation for thoroughness was well known throughout the county's law enforcement community. Linda stood in the doorway between the living room and kitchen, her posture rigid with the defensive tension of someone who'd been caught off guard by circumstances beyond her control. She'd managed to compose herself enough to offer the officers coffee, her voice carrying the forced hospitality that small-town residents reflexively extended to authority figures, but her eyes kept darting toward the office where the newspaper clippings waited like evidence in a case she didn't understand. Officer Rodriguez declined the coffee with professional courtesy, his attention already focused on the reason for their visit. "We're responding to a situation downtown," he explained, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone delivering information that required careful attention. "There's been an incident at the First National Bank involving a hostage situation. The perpetrator is demanding to speak with the highest-ranking law enforcement official available, and our communications center received information suggesting that might be someone at this address." The words hung in the air like smoke from a doused fire, creating confusion where there should have been clarity. Linda's face reflected complete bewilderment, her mind clearly struggling to process how a police emergency could possibly connect to her dead father's house on the outskirts of town. Jessica had emerged from the office, her designer clothes and city polish making her look oddly out of place among the rural furnishings and family photographs that decorated Joe's modest living room. "I'm sorry, Officer Rodriguez," Linda said, her voice tight with barely controlled irritation, "but I think there's been some kind of mistake. There's no law enforcement here, just family members dealing with funeral arrangements. My father passed away yesterday, and we're simply going through his belongings. I can't imagine why anyone would think to send you here for police business." Rodriguez exchanged a meaningful glance with Sergeant Mills, their shared expression suggesting they'd encountered similar confusion before, but remained confident in their information. "The dispatcher was very specific, ma'am," Mills interjected, her tone respectful but firm. "We received word from Columbus Metro that Chief Marcus Thompson was attending a family funeral in Millfield today, and might be available to assist with this situation. The bank robber specifically asked for a chief, and frankly, we don't have anyone of that rank in our small department." The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of revelation and the sudden restructuring of assumptions that had seemed unshakable just moments before. Linda's mouth opened and closed without sound, her mind visibly racing to process information that contradicted everything she'd believed about her nephew's life and career. Jessica's face had gone pale, her marketing executive confidence crumbling in the face of facts that rendered her condescending advice absurd. Robert appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by voices that had taken on an official gravity he hadn't expected in his father-in-law's house. His weathered face showed the same confusion that had overtaken his wife and daughter, but beneath it was something else, a dawning recognition that perhaps he'd been too quick to accept Linda's version of family dynamics without question. "Chief Thompson," Rodriguez continued, scanning the room with professional assessment, "we were told you might be here. The situation downtown is escalating, and we could really use someone with your experience and rank to help resolve this peacefully. Our local sheriff is out of town at a conference, and the state police are at least an hour away." Every eye in the room turned toward me, their gazes carrying different weights of expectation, confusion, and dawning realization. The moment had arrived with the subtle drama of sunrise, rather than the explosive force of lightning, but its impact was no less transformative for its quiet delivery. The carefully maintained fiction of my failed career lay in ruins around us, destroyed not by angry confrontation, but by the simple arrival of professionals who knew the truth. I stepped forward, my voice steady, despite the emotional earthquake that was reshaping the landscape of family relationships in real time. "I'm Chief Thompson," I said, meeting Rodriguez's eyes with the directness that came naturally after years of command responsibility. "What can you tell me about the situation at the bank?" The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and complete. Rodriguez and Mills straightened into postures of professional respect, their body language acknowledging the presence of a superior officer despite the civilian clothes and informal setting. Linda sank into Joe's favorite armchair, as if her legs could no longer support her, while Jessica remained frozen near the office door, her worldview undergoing radical reconstruction with each passing moment. "We have a single perpetrator," Rodriguez reported, his tone shifting into the crisp efficiency of an officer briefing a superior. "Male, approximately 35, armed with what appears to be a handgun. He entered the bank just before closing, took 6 hostages including 2 tellers and 4 customers. No shots fired yet, but he's agitated and specifically demanded to speak with a police chief. Says he won't negotiate with anyone of lower rank." The familiar rhythm of crisis management settled over me like a well-worn coat, pushing aside the emotional turmoil of family drama in favor of the clear priorities that defined emergency response. The training kicked in automatically, years of experience organizing my thoughts around threat assessment, resource allocation, and tactical options. This was work I understood completely, responsibilities I'd carried successfully through dozens of similar situations. "How long has he been inside?" I asked, my mind already processing the timeline and its implications for hostage psychology and tactical response options. "What's your current perimeter situation, and do we have communication established with the subject?" Mills consulted her notebook with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood the importance of accurate information during crisis situations. "Approximately 45 minutes since initial entry, we have the building surrounded with local units and county backup en route. No direct communication yet, but he's been shouting demands through the front door, wants a police chief, safe passage out of town, and keeps mentioning something about his brother being killed by police in Cincinnati last month." The personal motivation behind the hostage situation began to take shape, suggesting a grievance-driven individual rather than someone seeking purely financial gain. These cases required different approaches, demanded understanding of the emotional landscape that had driven someone to desperate measures. The brother's death added complexity, creating a situation where the perpetrator might view law enforcement as both the problem and the only possible solution to his crisis. Linda's voice cut through the professional discussion like broken glass scraping against concrete. "I don't understand what's happening," she said, her words emerging in a whisper that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of the room. "Marcus, you're a police chief. When did this happen? How is this possible?" Her confusion was so complete, so childlike in its bewilderment, that I felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for the woman who'd spent the day dismissing my achievements as failures. The narrative she'd constructed about my life wasn't malicious so much as it was protective, a way of making sense of my absence that allowed her to maintain her position as the family's success story without feeling threatened by alternative definitions of accomplishment. "I've been with Columbus Metro for 8 years, I explained, my voice gentle despite the urgency of the situation developing downtown. "Started as a detective, worked my way up through the ranks. I've been chief for the last 2 years. I kept it quiet because I wanted to avoid family complications, wanted to keep work and personal life separate." Jessica found her voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. "But Mom said you worked at a desk job, that you could barely pay your bills, that Grandpa Joe was disappointed in how your life turned out." The pain in her words was real, the confusion genuine. She'd been operating on information that had shaped her treatment of me, her understanding of our relationship, her assessment of my choices and their consequences. The discovery that this information was fundamentally wrong created a crisis of perception that went far beyond simple embarrassment. "Grandpa Joe knew exactly what I did for a living," I said, gesturing toward the office where his bulletin board of newspaper clippings waited as evidence of his pride and attention. "We talked about my work regularly. He understood why I couldn't always visit as often as I'd like, understood the responsibilities that came with the job. He was proud of what I'd accomplished, even if he didn't talk about it with the rest of the family." Rodriguez cleared his throat with the diplomatic patience of someone who'd learned to navigate family dynamics during crisis situations. "Chief Thompson, I hate to interrupt, but the situation downtown is getting more urgent. The perpetrator is becoming increasingly agitated, and we're concerned about the safety of the hostages. Would you be willing to come with us and assess the situation? The request was professional necessity intersecting with family revelation, duty calling in the middle of personal crisis, but there was no real choice involved, no question about priorities when lives were at stake. The hostages at First National Bank needed immediate attention from someone with experience in crisis negotiation, and the family's emotional processing would have to wait until innocent people were safe. I need to change clothes, I said, already moving toward my overnight bag in Joe's guest room. I'll be ready to go in 5 minutes. Can you brief me on the layout of the bank building and the tactical resources we have available? Mills nodded, pulling out her phone to contact the command center that had been established near the bank. Rodriguez began describing the building's architecture, the positions of the surrounding units, and the preliminary assessment of the perpetrator's behavior patterns. The familiar language of tactical planning filled the room, creating a cocoon of professional focus that temporarily suspended the emotional aftermath of family revelations. Linda remained in Joe's chair, her face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of pride. The woman who'd spent the day directing me to serve food and clean tables was confronting the reality that she'd been ordering around a police chief, someone whose professional responsibilities included life and death decisions affecting entire communities. Robert stepped closer to his wife, his hand settling on her shoulder with the gentle support of someone who'd learned to recognize when she needed anchoring. His own face reflected a mixture of embarrassment and growing respect, the gradual adjustment of someone forced to completely recalibrate his understanding of a family member he thought he'd known completely. Kevin appeared in the living room, drawn by the unusual activity and the presence of uniformed officers in his grandfather's house. His expression showed none of the shock that had overtaken his parents and sister, but rather a kind of satisfied vindication, as if he'd suspected all along that there was more to my story than the family had been willing to acknowledge. "Well," he said, his voice carrying a note of dark humor, "I guess that explains why you never seemed too worried about Mom's job offers." I emerged from the guest room wearing the spare uniform I'd brought for emergencies, the familiar weight of the badge and insignia transforming me from grieving grandson into the law enforcement professional I'd been for nearly a decade. The change was more than cosmetic, it represented a shift in identity from the family disappointment I'd been portrayed as to the community leader I'd actually become. The sight of me in full uniform seemed to complete the transformation of understanding in the room. Jessica's mouth fell open as she processed the visual evidence of authority and responsibility that contradicted everything she'd believed about my career prospects. Linda's eyes widened as she recognized the insignia of rank that marked me as someone who commanded respect and trust from others in ways she'd never imagined. Rodriguez and Mills straightened into more formal postures, their body language acknowledging the presence of a superior officer, despite the unusual circumstances of our meeting. The casual conversation that had marked their initial arrival gave way to the crisp professionalism that defined interactions between officers of different ranks during active operations. "Chief Thompson," Rodriguez reported, "the situation has escalated. The perpetrator just fired a warning shot into the ceiling and is demanding immediate contact with a police chief. He says he'll start shooting hostages if we don't produce one within the next 15 minutes. The timeline compressed around us, urgency replacing the leisurely pace of family gathering with the sharp focus of crisis response. Lives hung in the balance, and whatever personal revelations had emerged during the last few minutes would have to be processed later, after innocent people were safe and the immediate threat had been neutralized." I turned toward the door, my mind already shifting into the analytical mode that had served me well during similar situations. But before leaving Joe's house, before returning to the professional world, where my identity was clear and my authority unquestioned, I looked back at the family members who were still struggling to reconcile their assumptions with reality. "We'll finish this conversation later," I said, my voice carrying the gentle authority I'd learned to use when managing both criminal suspects and concerned citizens. "There are people downtown who need help right now,
but I want you to know that everything Eleanor Walsh told you was true. Grandpa Joe was proud of what I'd accomplished, and he understood why I made the choices I did." Linda nodded wordlessly, her hand pressed to her mouth, as if trying to contain emotions too large and complicated for immediate expression. Jessica remained frozen in place, her mind visibly working to process the implications of discoveries that would require her to re-examine years of family interactions and personal judgments. The drive to downtown Millfield took less than 10 minutes, but it provided enough time for Rodriguez and Mills to brief me on the tactical situation and the resources available for resolving the crisis. The perpetrator had been identified as David Chen, whose brother Michael had been killed during a traffic stop in Cincinnati 3 weeks earlier under circumstances that remained under investigation by the state police. The grievance was personal and specific, making David Chen someone who might be reached through careful negotiation that acknowledged his loss while establishing clear boundaries for acceptable behavior. The key would be demonstrating understanding of his pain without legitimizing his methods, offering him a path toward justice that didn't require harming innocent people who bore no responsibility for his brother's death. First National Bank sat at the corner of Main Street and 3rd Avenue, a brick structure that had served the community for nearly 70 years with the solid reliability that small towns demanded from their financial institutions. Police vehicles surrounded the building in a perimeter that balanced tactical necessity with the practical reality of limited personnel, their emergency lights creating a pulsing rhythm of red and blue that turned the familiar streetscape into something from a television drama. The command post had been established in the parking lot of Murphy's hardware store across the street, where Sergeant Mills introduced me to the other officers who'd responded to the crisis. Their faces reflected the mixture of relief and professional curiosity that came with the arrival of someone with higher rank and greater experience in hostage negotiation, but also the wariness of small-town officers dealing with a situation that exceeded their normal operational parameters. "Chief Thompson," said Lieutenant Dan Walsh from the County Sheriff's Department, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone managing a crisis with limited resources, "we've got 6 civilians inside, all of them local residents, 2 tellers, 4 customers including Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, who's 83 and has a heart condition. Chen's been getting more agitated as time passes, and we're running out of options for peaceful resolution." The familiar weight of command responsibility settled over me as I studied the building layout and assessed the tactical situation. This was why I'd spent years training, why I'd accepted the burdens of leadership, why I'd chosen a career that required making life and death decisions under pressure. The personal drama unfolding at Joe's house would wait right now. 6 innocent people needed someone with the experience and authority to bring them home safely. The radio crackled with Chen's voice, distorted by distance and emotion but clear enough to understand his demand. He wanted justice for his brother, wanted someone in authority to acknowledge the wrong that had been done, wanted assurance that Michael's death wouldn't be forgotten or dismissed as acceptable collateral damage in the complex relationship between
police and community. I took the radio from Lieutenant Walsh, feeling the familiar weight of lives, depending on words chosen carefully and delivered with the right combination of authority and compassion. The next few minutes would determine whether this crisis ended with handshakes or body bags, whether David Chen found a path back from the edge of desperation or committed acts that would destroy more lives than had already been lost. "This is Chief Marcus Thompson," I said into the radio, my voice carrying across the distance between the command post and the bank, where a grieving brother held innocent people hostage while seeking something that might have been justice or might have been revenge. Final parts 11, 14, resolution and new beginnings. David Chen's voice emerged from the bank's interior with the raw desperation of someone who'd reached the end of his emotional resources. "Chief Thompson," he called through the reinforced glass doors, his words carrying the weight of grief transformed into dangerous action. "They killed my brother for a broken taillight. 26 years old, never hurt anybody, and they shot him down like a dog in the street. I need someone to tell me how that's justice." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, the kind of anguish that could drive rational people to irrational acts when they felt the system had failed them completely. I'd encountered similar situations before, moments when personal tragedy collided with institutional authority in ways that created explosive potential. The key was acknowledging the legitimacy of his grief while establishing clear boundaries for acceptable resolution. "David," I responded, my voice carrying across the space between us with the calm authority that came from years of crisis negotiation. "I can hear the pain in your voice, and I want you to know that I'm here to listen. But right now, there are 6 innocent people in there with you who don't deserve to be caught in the middle of this. Can you tell me if anyone's been hurt?" A pause stretched between question and answer, filled with the ambient sounds of a small town that had suddenly become the stage for life and death drama. Through the bank's windows, I could see shapes moving inside, the shadowy figures of hostages who were probably wondering if they'd see their families again. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson's heart condition added urgency to an already critical situation, and every minute that passed increased the medical risks for someone her age under such stress. "Nobody's hurt yet," Chen replied, but his voice carried an undertone of threat that suggested the situation could change quickly. "But I'm not letting anybody leave until someone explains to me how a traffic stop for a broken taillight turns into a funeral. My brother was studying to be a teacher. He volunteered at the community center, helped kids with their homework. What kind of threat was he to anybody?" The question hung in the air like smoke, demanding acknowledgement of systemic failures that extended far beyond the authority of any single police chief. Chen's brother had become another statistic in the complex relationship between law enforcement and community, another name on a list that grew longer despite the best efforts of people who wanted to build bridges instead of walls. Lieutenant Walsh moved closer, his radio ready to coordinate tactical response if negotiation failed. Behind him, other officers maintained their positions around the building's perimeter, their weapons ready but their postures reflecting the hope that this crisis could be resolved without additional violence. The small-town setting added complexity to what might have been routine procedure in larger jurisdictions, where anonymity provided some protection for decision-makers. "David," I said, choosing my words with the care of someone who understood that language could either diffuse or escalate the situation, "I can't bring your brother back, and I can't change what happened in Cincinnati, but I can promise you that his death won't be forgotten, that the investigation into what went wrong will be thorough and honest. What I need from you is to let these innocent people go home to their families. They're not responsible for your pain." The negotiation continued for 47 minutes, each exchange building toward either peaceful resolution or tragic escalation. Chen's demands evolved as we talked, shifting from impossible requests for resurrection to achievable goals like media attention for his brother's case and assurance that the investigation would be conducted transparently. The hostages remained safe throughout the conversation, their welfare protected by Chen's fundamental decency despite his desperate circumstances. Mrs. Henderson's voice eventually emerged from inside the bank, her elderly authority cutting through the tension with the directness that came from 8 decades of dealing with life's complications. "Young man," she said, her words audible through the glass doors, "I knew your brother when he was a child. He used to help me with my groceries when I couldn't manage them myself. He was a good boy who grew into a good man, and his death was a terrible tragedy. But holding us here won't bring him justice, and it won't honor his memory." Her intervention proved decisive, providing Chen with a face and voice that connected his grief to the community he was threatening. Mrs. Henderson had known Michael Chen as a person rather than a statistic, had benefited from his kindness, had mourned his death along with the rest of Millfield's residents. Her words carried moral authority that transcended the tactical considerations dominating the standoff. The resolution came quietly, without dramatic gestures or climactic moments. Chen opened the bank's doors and allowed the hostages to walk out into the afternoon sunlight, their faces reflecting relief mixed with compassion for the young man whose grief had driven him to desperate measures. He emerged behind them, with his hands raised, his weapon discarded inside the building, his expression showing exhaustion rather than defiance. The arrest was conducted with professional courtesy that acknowledged Chen's fundamental humanity despite his criminal actions. He'd crossed legal lines that required consequences, but the circumstances that had driven him to those choices generated sympathy even among the officers who were obligated to take him into custody. The system would process his case with appropriate gravity while recognizing that justice sometimes required understanding as much as punishment. Lieutenant Walsh coordinated the scene's aftermath with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that successful crisis resolution involved more than simply ending immediate threats. Media representatives had begun arriving from neighboring towns, drawn by reports of hostage situation and police response that would generate headlines in regional newspapers. The story would need careful management to ensure accuracy while protecting the privacy of everyone involved. Mrs. Henderson declined medical attention despite concerns about her heart condition, insisting that she felt fine and wanted only to return home to her cats and her evening television programs. The other hostages showed varying degrees of stress reaction, but none required immediate hospitalization. They'd been traumatized by circumstances beyond their control but had emerged physically unharmed from an experience that could have ended tragically. The drive back to Joe's house provided time for decompression, for the gradual transition from crisis mode back to the personal drama that had been interrupted by duty. Rodriguez and Mills had handled themselves professionally throughout the incident, their competence reflecting well on the small-town departments that often faced criticism for inadequate resources and training. Their respect for my authority had been genuine and complete, unmarked by the jurisdictional tensions that sometimes complicated interagency cooperation. Joe's house appeared unchanged from the outside, its modest architecture and rural setting unchanged by the revelations that had occurred within its walls. But I knew that the relationships inside had been fundamentally altered, that assumptions carefully maintained for years had been shattered by the simple arrival of truth in the form of uniformed officers seeking professional assistance. The family gathering I'd left 2 hours earlier had been transformed into something entirely different. Linda met me at the front door, her face showing the emotional exhaustion that comes from processing information that challenges core beliefs about reality. The woman who'd spent the morning directing me to serve food and clean tables now stood before someone whose professional authority she was only beginning to comprehend. Her eyes held questions that had been accumulating during my absence, concerns that would require careful attention and honest answers. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying none of its earlier dismissive authority, "the news just reported that you resolved a hostage situation downtown. They said you saved 6 people's lives. I don't know what to say, how to process what I've learned today. I feel like I don't know you at all, like I've been wrong about everything." Her confession carried the weight of genuine remorse, the recognition that years of casual dismissal and condescending assumptions had been based on fundamental misunderstanding rather than factual assessment. The pain in her voice was real, the embarrassment acute, but beneath both emotions was something that might have been the beginning of respect for accomplishments she'd never thought to investigate or acknowledge. Jessica appeared beside her mother, her earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty and what looked like the early stages of genuine humility. The marketing executive who'd offered to help me find local work now understood that her condescension had been directed toward someone whose professional responsibilities exceeded her own in scope and significance. Her face reflected the internal recalibration required when discovering that assumptions about family hierarchy had been completely inverted. We sat in Joe's living room as evening settled over Millfield, the familiar surroundings providing stability for conversations that required careful navigation through emotional territory none of us had mapped before. The bulletin board in the office remained as evidence of the pride Joe had taken in my accomplishments, but more importantly, it served as proof that at least one family member had understood and celebrated my choices without reservation. Robert emerged from the kitchen carrying coffee for everyone, his quiet dignity unchanged by the day's revelations but his manner toward me subtly different, marked by the respect one professional extends to another. He'd always been the family member most comfortable with allowing others to define their own success, least invested in controlling narratives about appropriate life choices. His acceptance of the new information felt natural and complete. Kevin settled into a corner chair with the satisfied expression of someone whose instincts had been vindicated by events. He'd never fully accepted the family's dismissive attitude toward my career, had sensed that there was more to the story than Linda's convenient explanations. His validation felt generous rather than triumphant, focused on family healing rather than personal vindication. The conversation that followed stretched late into the evening, covering years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities for connection. Linda's assumptions had been rooted in her own fears about losing family members to the broader world, her inability to conceive of success that didn't conform to familiar patterns. Her control of family narrative had been protective rather than malicious, designed to maintain cohesion rather than inflict harm. Jessica's condescension had emerged from similar protective instincts, her need to believe that family members who stayed geographically close were somehow more successful or fulfilled than those who ventured into unknown territory. Her marketing skills, impressive in their own right, had never required the life-and-death decision-making that defined police leadership, but she'd assumed that visibility equated to significance. The most important revelation was Joe's consistent pride in my accomplishments, his understanding that service to community could take many forms and that success should be measured by impact rather than proximity. His bulletin board had been a shrine to achievements he'd celebrated privately while respecting my desire for family privacy. His love had been constant and unconditional, unmarked by the complications that had affected other family relationships. As midnight approached, we began the process of rebuilding relationships on foundations of truth rather than assumption. Linda apologized with genuine emotion for years of dismissive treatment, acknowledging that her need to control family narrative had blinded her to realities that should have been obvious. Jessica expressed embarrassment about her condescending offer to help me find local work, recognizing how insulting such suggestions must have seemed to someone whose professional achievements exceeded her own. The forgiveness came easily because the harm had been rooted in ignorance rather than malice. Linda's assumptions had been wrong but not cruel. Jessica's condescension had been misguided but not vindictive. They'd operated on incomplete information, filling gaps in knowledge with conclusions that supported their own emotional needs rather than acknowledging the possibility of alternatives they couldn't imagine. But the most meaningful aspect of the evening's conversation was the recognition that Joe had understood everything, had been proud of my choices, had celebrated my accomplishments even while respecting my desire for privacy. The newspaper clippings on his bulletin board represented years of attention and approval that had existed independently of family politics or personal insecurities. His love had been constant and informed based on facts rather than assumptions. The funeral service the following morning felt different from the gathering that had preceded my identity revelation. Community members who had known Joe well approached me with references to conversations they'd had with him about my career, stories about his pride in my accomplishments, memories of his excitement when newspaper articles mentioned my work. The picture that emerged was of a grandfather who had understood and celebrated my choices while protecting my privacy from family members who might not have been ready to accept such information. Mrs. Henderson, recovered from her ordeal at the bank, made a point of thanking me publicly for the professional manner in which the hostage situation had been resolved. Her endorsement carried significant weight in a community where her family had been prominent for 3 generations, and her words helped establish my credentials with residents who had known me only as Joe Thompson's grandson. The graveside service concluded with military honors that reflected Joe's service during the Korean War, the folded flag presented to Linda as his eldest surviving relative. But as we stood around the simple headstone that would mark his final resting place, I felt the presence of a man who had understood that family love could transcend geographical distance, that success could be measured in service to others, that pride could exist without publicity or recognition. The reception after the burial was different from the previous day's gathering, marked by genuine conversation rather than polite social obligation. Community members shared stories about Joe's quiet generosity, his willingness to help neighbors without expecting recognition, his belief that character was demonstrated through consistent action rather than dramatic gesture. The portrait that emerged was of a man whose values had shaped my career choice even when I hadn't consciously recognized the connection. Linda approached me as the afternoon wore on, her manner completely changed from the dismissive authority she'd displayed during the previous day's gathering.
"Marcus," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion, "I want you to know how sorry I am for the way I treated you yesterday. I had no right to make assumptions about your life, no right to speak for Joe about his feelings toward your choices. I hope you can forgive me, and I hope we can rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth rather than my stubborn ignorance." Her apology was complete and heartfelt, unmarked by the defensive qualifications that often accompany admissions of error. She'd recognized not just the factual mistakes in her assumptions but the fundamental disrespect she'd shown toward my autonomy and accomplishments. The change in her attitude was profound and apparently permanent, based on recognition of realities that couldn't be wished away or reinterpreted. Jessica's approach was more hesitant, her embarrassment about the previous day's condescending advice still visible in her expression. She'd built much of her self-image on being the successful family member who'd made appropriate choices and achieved conventional milestones. The discovery that her assumptions about family hierarchy had been inverted required significant adjustment to her understanding of relationships and accomplishments. But her apology was equally sincere, focused on recognition that she'd presumed to offer guidance to someone whose professional responsibilities exceeded her own in complexity and significance. Her marketing expertise was valuable and hard-earned, but it hadn't prepared her for the humility required when discovering that family members might have achieved success in areas she couldn't assess or appreciate. The afternoon conversation revealed layers of misunderstanding that had accumulated over years of limited contact and poor communication. My desire for privacy about professional accomplishments had been misinterpreted as evidence of failure or embarrassment. The demands of police work that had limited my availability for family gatherings had been seen as disinterest rather than professional obligation. The secrecy that had protected my personal life from work-related complications had created information voids that family members had filled with their own assumptions. But most importantly, the conversation revealed Joe's consistent pride in my accomplishments, his understanding of the choices I'd made, his respect for my desire to build a career based on service to community rather than proximity to family. The bulletin board in his office had been just one expression of attention and approval that had existed independently of family politics or personal insecurities. The resolution felt complete without being artificial, based on genuine recognition of mistakes rather than social pressure to forgive and forget. Linda's acknowledgement of her errors was specific and heartfelt. Jessica's embarrassment was appropriate and constructive. Robert's quiet acceptance provided stability for family healing. Most importantly, the memory of Joe's pride and understanding provided a foundation for rebuilding relationships based on truth rather than assumption. As I prepared to return to Columbus the following morning, the rental car loaded with personal items from Joe's house that Linda had insisted I take, the transformation in family dynamics felt permanent rather than temporary. The crisis that had revealed my true profession had also revealed the depth of misunderstanding that had existed for years, but it had created opportunity for authentic connection based on facts rather than assumptions. The drive back to Columbus provided time for reflection on the weekend's events, the unexpected intersection of personal and professional responsibilities, the way truth had emerged through circumstances no one could have anticipated. The hostage situation had required skills and experience that validated years of training and career development, but more importantly, it had demonstrated to my family that my choices had been based on calling rather than convenience. The knowledge that Joe had understood and celebrated my accomplishments throughout my career felt like a gift that would continue to provide comfort during difficult moments. His bulletin board had been evidence of pride that existed independently of family politics, love that transcended geographical distance, respect for choices that others might not have understood or appreciated. The Monday morning return to headquarters in Columbus marked a transition from family crisis back to professional routine, from personal revelation to organizational responsibility. But the weekend's events had created a bridge between two aspects of my identity that had been artificially separated for years, allowing for integration that felt both natural and overdue. The phone call from Linda came that evening, her voice carrying the warmth that had been missing from our relationship for years. She wanted to thank me again for the professional manner in which I'd handled the hostage situation, but more importantly, she wanted to invite me for Sunday dinner the following weekend, an opportunity to continue rebuilding family connections based on honesty rather than assumption. Jessica's text message arrived an hour later, her words carefully chosen to express genuine interest in learning about my work and acknowledging her previous ignorance about the demands and responsibilities of law enforcement leadership. Her marketing background had given her skills in communication and persuasion, but she recognized that police work required different forms of expertise that she'd never thought to appreciate or understand. The conversation with Kevin came through social media, his message carrying the dry humor that had always marked our interactions, but also genuine pride in my accomplishments and gratitude for the way I'd handled both the professional crisis and the family revelations. His unconventional lifestyle had made him sensitive to judgmental assumptions, and he appreciated the way truth had ultimately prevailed over prejudice. The most meaningful contact came from Mrs. Henderson, who called to thank me personally for the respectful manner in which the hostage situation had been resolved and to share additional memories of conversations she'd had with Joe about my career. Her words provided further evidence of the pride he'd taken in my accomplishments, the attention he'd paid to my professional development, the love that had existed independently of family complications. The weeks that followed brought gradual healing of relationships that had been damaged by years of misunderstanding and poor communication. Linda's invitations for family gatherings became regular rather than obligatory, marked by genuine interest in my work and life rather than polite social obligation. Jessica's questions about law enforcement reflected authentic curiosity rather than condescending concern about my career prospects. Most importantly, Joe's memory became a source of family unity rather than individual grief, his values and example providing guidance for rebuilding connections based on respect rather than assumption. The bulletin board in his office was relocated to Linda's house, where it served as a reminder of the pride he'd taken in all his family members' accomplishments, the love that had transcended geographical distance and professional differences. The transformation felt complete when Linda called 6 months later to invite me to speak at the high school career day, her pride in my accomplishments evident in her voice as she described my background to the event organizers. The woman who had once dismissed my work as a failed office job now wanted to share my professional achievements with young people considering their own career choices. The speaking engagement provided opportunity to honor Joe's memory while inspiring the next generation of public servants, connecting his values of community service with contemporary challenges in law enforcement and public safety. The students' questions reflected genuine interest in police work as a calling rather than just a job, understanding that service to community could take many forms but required consistent commitment to principles larger than personal convenience. Standing in the same high school auditorium where Joe had once served on the school board, speaking to young people who reminded me of my own teenage uncertainty about the future, I felt the connection between past and present, between individual choice and family legacy, between service to community and personal fulfillment. The weekend that had begun with family dismissal and ended with professional crisis had ultimately created opportunity for authentic connection and mutual respect. The story of my grandfather's funeral had become something larger than family drama or professional obligation. It had become a reminder that truth eventually emerges despite attempts to suppress or distort it, that love transcends misunderstanding even when communication fails, that service to others provides meaning that survives individual mortality. Joe's pride in my accomplishments had existed independently of family recognition, but its eventual revelation had healed relationships and created foundation for future connection. The final lesson was perhaps the most important, that family love could coexist with professional calling, that geographical distance didn't diminish emotional connection, that success could be measured in service to others rather than approval from relatives. Joe had understood these truths throughout his life, and his example continued to provide guidance long after his death, connecting past wisdom with present responsibility in ways that honored both individual achievement and family legacy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the freshly mowed cemetery grass as I walked toward Joe's headstone, carrying the small bouquet of wild flowers I'd picked from the field behind his old house.
5 years had passed since that transformative weekend when family assumptions collided with reality and the simple granite marker had weathered into the landscape as if it had always belonged there. The inscription remained crisp and clear, marking the final resting place of a man whose influence continued to shape the lives of those who'd known him. Linda emerged from her car parked along the cemetery road, moving with the careful dignity that had replaced her former need to control every family interaction. Age had softened some of her sharper edges, but more significantly, the revelations about my career had fundamentally altered her approach to family relationships. She no longer presumed to know what was best for everyone else, no longer filled information gaps with assumptions that served her emotional needs rather than reflecting actual circumstances. We'd established a routine of meeting at Joe's grave on the anniversary of his death, a tradition that had grown into something meaningful rather than obligatory. These visits provided opportunity for quiet reflection and continued family healing, chances to honor his memory while acknowledging how his values continued to influence our choices and relationships. The conversations that occurred during these cemetery visits had become some of our most honest and productive family communications. Jessica approached from the opposite direction, her professional attire
reflecting the genuine success she'd achieved in expanding her marketing firm into 3 additional cities. But her manner toward me had been permanently changed by the weekend that revealed how wrong her assumptions had been. She'd learned to ask questions rather than make pronouncements, to show genuine interest in others' accomplishments rather than dismissing what she didn't understand. The corporate success she'd achieved over the past 5 years had been substantial and well-earned, but it had also taught her that professional accomplishment could take many forms, and that comparing different types of achievement was both pointless and destructive. Her marketing expertise had value and significance, but she'd learned to appreciate that police work required different skills and carried different responsibilities that were equally worthy of respect. Robert appeared beside the maintenance shed, carrying a small shovel and a watering can filled from the cemetery's outdoor spigot. He'd appointed himself caretaker of Joe's gravesite, ensuring that the flowers planted around the headstone received adequate care and that the area remained properly maintained. His quiet assumption of this responsibility reflected his character and provided a tangible way to honor the memory of someone who'd shaped his understanding of duty and service. Kevin's motorcycle rumbled to life in the parking area as he shut off the engine and removed his helmet, his unconventional arrival consistent with the individualistic approach he'd maintained throughout his adult life. But his presence at these annual gatherings had become as reliable as anyone else's, his respect for Joe's memory transcending any discomfort he might feel about family obligations or social expectations. The 5 of us stood in a loose circle around the headstone, each lost in private thoughts about the man who'd brought us together and the changes his death had catalyzed in our family dynamics. The silence wasn't uncomfortable but contemplative, filled with memories and gratitude rather than grief or regret. Joe's influence had outlasted his physical presence, continuing to provide guidance through the example he'd set and the values he'd modeled. I placed the wild flowers against the base of the headstone, their informal beauty contrasting with the more elaborate arrangements that marked nearby graves. Joe had always preferred simple pleasures and unpretentious gestures, finding meaning in authenticity rather than expensive display. The wild flowers seemed appropriate for someone who'd measured worth through character rather than cost, impact rather than appearance. Linda broke the silence with words that would have been impossible 5 years earlier, before revelations had forced her to reconsider assumptions that had shaped decades of family interaction. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying genuine warmth rather than manufactured pleasantry, "I want you to know how proud Joe would be of what you've accomplished this year. The article in the Columbus Dispatch about your department's community policing initiative, the way you've built bridges between law enforcement and neighborhoods that had lost trust in police." He always believed that real success meant making life better for other people. Her acknowledgement reflected a complete transformation from the woman who'd once dismissed my career as a failed office job. The Linda who'd made me serve food while she accepted condolences had been replaced by someone who celebrated accomplishments she finally understood and respected. The change hadn't happened overnight, but it had been consistent and genuine, based on recognition of realities she could no longer deny or reinterpret. Jessica's contribution to the conversation reflected similar growth in her understanding of different forms of professional achievement. The leadership workshop you conducted for our Chamber of Commerce last month really opened my eyes, she said, her words carrying none of the condescension that had once marked her interactions with me. The way you talked about crisis management and community relations, the skills required for police leadership. I never realized how complex law enforcement administration could be, how much it required understanding of psychology and sociology and public policy. Her admission represented acknowledgement that her own professional expertise, impressive as it was, hadn't prepared her to assess the demands and responsibilities of police work. The marketing skills that had built her successful business were valuable and hard-earned, but they operated in a different sphere from the life-and-death decision-making that defined law enforcement leadership. She'd learned to appreciate rather than dismiss forms of accomplishment she couldn't personally evaluate. Robert's contribution was characteristically practical and understated, focused on concrete actions rather than emotional processing. The scholarship fund we established in Joe's name has awarded its first grants, he reported, his voice carrying satisfaction rather than pride. 3 high school seniors who want to pursue careers in public service, whether that's law enforcement, firefighting, teaching, or social work. The selection committee felt that Joe would have approved of supporting young people who want to serve their communities. The scholarship had been Linda's idea, but Robert had handled the administrative details with the methodical care he brought to all worthwhile projects. The fund would provide ongoing tribute to Joe's values while supporting young people who shared his commitment to community service. The recipients wouldn't necessarily pursue law enforcement careers, but they'd all demonstrated interest in work that prioritized public benefit over personal advancement. Kevin's perspective remained unconventional but had gained depth through observation of family changes that had occurred since Joe's death. The old man knew what he was doing when he kept all those newspaper clippings, he said, his tone carrying appreciation rather than surprise. He understood people better than most of us realized, knew how to be proud of someone without making a big production about it. Took wisdom to recognize that Marcus needed privacy about his work while still celebrating what he'd accomplished. His observation captured something essential about Joe's character: the ability to love and support family members while respecting their autonomy and choices. Joe had never demanded conformity to his own vision of success, had never required family members to justify their decisions or seek his approval for their life choices. His love had been constant and unconditional, unmarked by the need to control or manipulate others' behavior. The conversation gradually shifted from remembrance to current events, family updates shared in the comfortable informality that had replaced the defensive interactions that had once characterized our gatherings. Linda talked about her volunteer work with the local literacy program, finding fulfillment in teaching adults to read rather than managing family members' life choices. Jessica described her firm's expansion and the challenges of maintaining company culture while growing into new markets. Robert shared updates about his consulting work with small farmers, helping them navigate changing agricultural markets and environmental regulations. His expertise in practical problem solving had found new applications as family farms faced economic pressures that required innovative solutions. The work provided him with purpose while contributing to community sustainability and food security. Kevin's update reflected his continued commitment to unconventional choices, but with added depth and social awareness. His motorcycle repair business had evolved into a nonprofit program that taught mechanical skills to young men aging out of the foster care system, providing them with marketable abilities while building confidence and self-reliance. The program operated out of a donated garage space and relied heavily on volunteer instructors, but it had already helped dozens of participants find stable employment. My own update focused on departmental initiatives that had emerged from lessons learned during crisis situations like the bank hostage incident that had revealed my identity to the family. Community policing programs had expanded to include regular neighborhood meetings, youth mentorship opportunities, and collaborative problem-solving approaches that addressed underlying causes of crime rather than simply responding to symptoms. The conversation naturally evolved into planning for future family gatherings, discussions of holiday schedules, and vacation coordination that reflected genuine desire for continued connection rather than social obligation. The defensive maneuvering that had once characterized these discussions had been replaced by straightforward communication about preferences and constraints, honest assessment of what was possible rather than manipulation designed to create guilt or compliance. Linda's invitation for Thanksgiving dinner carried none of the passive-aggressive undertones that had once made such gatherings stressful for everyone involved. She genuinely wanted family connection but no longer needed to control every aspect of how that connection manifested. Her recognition that people might have legitimate conflicts or preferences had liberated her from the exhausting work of managing everyone else's choices. Jessica's suggestion for a family vacation reflected similar evolution in her approach to family relationships. She'd learned to propose ideas without taking rejection personally, to acknowledge that different family members might have different interests and availability. Her success in business had taught her that effective collaboration required understanding of others' priorities, rather than assumption that everyone shared her own preferences and goals. The planning discussion revealed how much family dynamics had changed since the revelations that occurred during Joe's funeral. Decisions were made through genuine consultation rather than manipulation or assumption. Conflicts were addressed directly rather than through passive-aggressive behavior or behind-the-scenes maneuvering. Most importantly, family members had learned to respect each other's autonomy while maintaining emotional connection. As the cemetery visit concluded and we prepared to return to our respective responsibilities, the sense of resolution felt permanent rather than temporary. The changes that had begun during that transformative weekend 5 years earlier had deepened into genuine transformation of family culture. Joe's death had catalyzed healing that might not have occurred otherwise, forcing conversations that had been avoided for years. The drive back to Columbus provided time for reflection on how the weekend that had begun with family dismissal and ended with professional crisis had ultimately created opportunity for authentic connection and mutual respect. The hostage situation had required skills and experience that validated years of training and career development, but more importantly, it had demonstrated to family members that my choices had been based on calling rather than convenience. The knowledge that Joe had understood and celebrated my accomplishments throughout my career continued to provide comfort during challenging moments. His bulletin board had been evidence of pride that existed independently of family politics, love that transcended geographical distance, respect for choices that others might not have understood or appreciated. His example continued to influence my approach to leadership and community service. The annual cemetery visits had become touchstones for family healing, opportunities to honor Joe's memory while acknowledging how his values continued to shape our choices and relationships. The conversations that occurred during these gatherings had become some of our most honest and productive family communications, unmarked by the defensive maneuvering that had once made such interactions stressful for everyone involved. The scholarship fund established in Joe's name had provided ongoing tribute to his values while supporting young people who shared his commitment to community service. The recipients represented diverse career paths but shared common dedication to work that prioritized public benefit over personal advancement. Their success would extend Joe's influence into future generations, multiplying the impact of values he'd modeled throughout his life. The most meaningful change had been the recognition that family love could coexist with professional calling, that geographical distance didn't diminish emotional connection, that success could be measured in service to others rather than approval from relatives. Joe had understood these truths throughout his life, and his example continued to provide guidance long after his death. The department's community policing initiatives had flourished in the years following the bank hostage incident, expanding into programs that addressed root causes of crime while building trust between law enforcement and community members. The approach required patience and long-term commitment, but it had produced measurable improvements in public safety while strengthening social cohesion in neighborhoods that had previously been marked by mutual suspicion. The leadership development programs I'd implemented for other departments had grown into a regional training network that shared best practices and innovative approaches to police work. The curriculum emphasized de-escalation techniques, community engagement strategies, and crisis intervention methods that prioritized peaceful resolution over force. The program had trained hundreds of officers who carried these approaches back to their own departments and communities. The speaking engagements at high schools and community colleges had become regular commitments that honored Joe's memory while inspiring young people to consider careers in public service. The students' questions reflected genuine interest in police work as a calling rather than just a job, understanding that service to community could take many forms but required consistent commitment to principles larger than personal convenience. The awards and recognition that had accumulated over the years felt meaningful because they reflected positive impact on community safety and police-citizen relations rather than personal achievement divorced from social benefit. Joe's values had shaped my understanding that true success was measured in service to others, that leadership required humility and accountability, that authority existed to protect rather than to dominate. The family relationships that had been rebuilt on foundations of truth rather than assumption had provided stability and support that enhanced rather than competed with professional responsibilities. Linda's pride in my accomplishments had replaced her dismissive assumptions. Jessica's respect had supplanted her condescending advice. Robert's quiet support had remained constant while gaining depth of understanding. The transformation felt complete because it was based on genuine recognition of realities rather than social pressure to forgive and forget. Linda's acknowledgement of her errors had been specific and heartfelt. Jessica's embarrassment had been appropriate and constructive. Robert's acceptance had provided stability for family healing. Most importantly, the memory of Joe's pride and understanding had provided foundation for authentic connection. The legacy of that transformative weekend continued to influence both family relationships and professional development, creating integration between personal identity and public service that felt natural rather than forced. The crisis that had revealed my true profession had also revealed the depth of misunderstanding that had existed for years, but it had created opportunity for healing based on facts rather than assumptions. The bulletin board from Joe's office, now displayed in Linda's living room, served as ongoing reminder of the pride he'd taken in all family members' accomplishments, the love that had transcended geographical distance and professional differences. The newspaper clippings represented years of attention and approval that had existed independently of family politics or personal insecurities. The story of Joe's funeral had become family legend, retold with humor and affection rather than embarrassment or regret. The weekend that had begun with casual dismissal and ended with professional crisis had ultimately demonstrated that truth eventually emerges despite attempts to suppress or distort it, that love transcends misunderstanding even when communication fails, that service to others provides meaning that survives individual mortality. The lessons learned during those intense days continued to influence daily decisions and long-term planning, both in family relationships and professional responsibilities. Joe's example of quiet dignity and consistent service provided guidance for navigating complex situations that required balancing competing demands and in maintaining integrity under pressure. The knowledge that family members now understood and respected my career choices had eliminated stress that had unconsciously influenced my behavior for years. The need to maintain secrecy about professional accomplishments had been replaced by opportunities to share experiences and seek advice from people who appreciated the complexities of law enforcement leadership. The community policing philosophy that had emerged from crisis situations like the bank hostage incident had influenced department policy and training programs throughout the region. The emphasis on relationship building and problem solving had produced measurable improvements in both crime statistics and community satisfaction with police services. The most enduring impact had been the recognition that authentic connection required honesty and vulnerability, that family love was strengthened rather than threatened by individual achievement, that service to community honored rather than conflicted with family values. Joe's wisdom had been vindicated by events that proved his understanding of both human nature and family dynamics. As I pulled into the police station parking lot in Columbus, preparing for another day of responsibilities and challenges, the memory of Joe's pride continued to provide motivation and guidance. His belief in the value of public service, his respect for individual choice, his understanding that love could transcend distance and difference, remained as relevant and influential as ever. The transformation that had begun with family crisis and professional emergency had evolved into sustained commitment to excellence in both personal relationships and community service. The integration felt natural and permanent, based on recognition that individual success was meaningless without positive impact on others, that leadership required accountability to principles larger than personal ambition. The story continued to unfold in daily interactions with colleagues and community members, in family gatherings marked by genuine affection rather than social obligation, in young officers who carried forward values of service and integrity that Joe had modeled throughout his life. His influence had multiplied through example and inspiration, creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond any individual career or family relationship. The cemetery visits would continue as long as family members remained able to participate, providing touchstones for remembrance and opportunities for ongoing connection. Joe's grave had become a place of peace rather than sorrow, a reminder of values that transcended individual mortality and continued to shape the choices of those who'd been privileged to know him. The wild flowers I'd placed at his headstone would bloom and fade according to natural cycles, but the love and respect they represented would remain constant. Joe's legacy lived on in family relationships, rebuilt on truth rather than assumption, in community programs that reflected his values of service and compassion, in young people inspired to pursue careers dedicated to helping others. The transformation was complete, but the story continued in ways both large and small, in daily decisions, to choose truth over convenience, service over self-interest, love over fear. Joe's example remained as relevant and inspiring as ever, proving that one person's commitment to integrity and compassion could influence generations long after their physical presence had ended. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.